Iranian missiles are hitting Saudi oil refineries right now. As you watch this, smoke is rising over Ras Tanura, one of the most critical energy facilities on the planet. Drones are being intercepted over Riyadh. Saudi Arabia has expelled Iranian diplomats. And behind closed doors, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has reportedly been calling the American president directly, urging him not to hold back, not to contain Iran, to destroy it. This is not a warning. This is not a simulation. This is April 2026, and the rivalry that has quietly shaped the Middle East for nearly 5 decades has finally exploded into something most analysts feared, but few expected to see this fast. But to understand how we got here and where we are going, you cannot start with today's headlines. You have to go back to the beginning because this conflict did not start with a missile strike. It started with a revolution, and everything since then, every war, every proxy battle, every diplomatic handshake, every broken ceasefire has been building toward this moment. If you want to understand what is actually happening in the Middle East right now and why it matters for the entire world, stay with us. Before 1979, Iran and Saudi Arabia were rivals, but it was the kind of rivalry you can manage. Both countries sat on the same side of the table when it came to American strategy in the Gulf. Iran under the Shah was closely aligned with the United States, and so was Saudi Arabia. They competed for influence, for prestige, for economic leverage, but it never felt like a zero-sum fight. Neither side believed the other was trying to erase it from the map. Then 1979 hit, and everything changed almost overnight. The Iranian Revolution did not just swap one leader for another. It transformed the entire identity of the state. Iran was no longer operating like a typical country focused on borders and stability. It rebranded itself as a revolutionary force built on the idea that its model should not stay inside Iran. The new leadership in Tehran saw its system as something meant to spread, something meant to reshape the region around it. From Riyadh's perspective, this was not just a shift in policy, it was a direct challenge to the entire order they relied on. Saudi Arabia was not just another state in the region. It was a monarchy deeply tied to religion, built on its role as the guardian of Sunni Islam and the protector of Mecca and Medina. Now, suddenly, Iran was stepping forward and positioning itself as the voice of Shia Muslims worldwide, offering an alternative model that directly competed with Saudi legitimacy. What had once been a controlled rivalry quickly turned into something much deeper. It stopped being about trade routes or regional influence and became ideological at its core. The sectarian divide between Sunni and Shia Islam moved to the front. But even that was often used as a political tool rather than purely a religious one. Underneath it all was a simple reality both sides understood. This was becoming a contest neither could afford to lose. And once you reach that point where both sides see the stakes as existential, the rules change. The first real explosion came in 1980, pulling the rivalry out of the shadows and into open conflict. The Iran-Iraq War turned Iraq under Saddam Hussein into the front line against Iran's revolutionary push. Saudi Arabia stepped in on Iraq's side, not because it trusted Saddam or shared his vision, but because it feared what Iran had become. From Riyadh's perspective, stopping Iran mattered more than anything else. And from Tehran's point of view, that changed everything. Saudi Arabia was no longer just a rival watching from a distance. It was now actively backing Iran's enemies. At the same time, oil became a weapon. Saudi Arabia had the ability to adjust production and influence global prices, which gave it a powerful economic lever. Iran, already stretched by war and cut off in many ways, did not have that same flexibility. So, when the fighting drained Iran on the battlefield, economic pressure squeezed it from the outside, a one-two punch that made the rivalry even more intense. Then the tension hit one of the most sensitive areas imaginable. In 1987, during the Hajj in Mecca, clashes broke out between Iranian pilgrims and Saudi security forces. What should have been a sacred journey turned into chaos. Over 400 pilgrims were killed, most of them Iranians. The reaction was immediate and emotional. Embassies were attacked. Anger spilled into the streets, and diplomatic ties between the two countries collapsed. At that point, the conflict stopped being just political or military. It reached into religion itself and into the lives of ordinary people. That kind of loss does not fade quickly. It lingers and it deepens resentment across entire communities. For a brief stretch after that, things seemed to cool down. Through the 1990s and the early 2000s, there were diplomatic visits, security agreements, and attempts to stabilize the relationship. On the surface, it looked like progress was being made, but underneath the core issues were still there, untouched. The rivalry had not ended. It had just gone quiet. Then 2003 arrived and the entire picture shifted again. The United States launched the Iraq War and removed Saddam Hussein from power. On paper, it looked like the fall of a dictator. In reality, it removed a key buffer that had been holding Iran back from deeper influence in the Arab world. What followed changed the region in ways few expected. A Shia-led government emerged in Baghdad, and Iran moved quickly to build influence through political alliances, militia networks, and economic ties. From Saudi Arabia's perspective, this was a nightmare unfolding in slow motion. What they saw was not just Iran gaining influence here and there, but a deliberate strategy that seemed to be knitting together a belt of Shia power across the region. Step by step, Tehran was building what many began to call a Shia crescent, stretching from Iran through Iraq into Syria and finally Lebanon. The sectarian divide was no longer just about identity or belief. It became a tool, something both sides could use to mobilize support, justify their actions, and deepen divisions across the region. This is the point where the rivalry fully moved into the open and became impossible to ignore. It shifted into its most visible and dangerous form, proxy wars. Iran built what it called the Axis of Resistance, a network of allied groups and militias spread across the region. Instead of sending large armies, Tehran leaned into something more flexible. Weapons, training, funding, and guidance flowed outward. And in return, those groups acted as forward pressure points. It was a low-cost strategy with high impact. Saudi Arabia responded by tightening its alignment with the United States. Riyadh opened key bases to American forces. By the 1990s, thousands of United States troops were stationed on Saudi soil, embedding American military presence directly into the kingdom's defense structure. At the same time, Saudi Arabia poured massive resources into arms deals. By the mid-2010s, these agreements had crossed the $100 billion mark, bringing in advanced fighter jets, missile defense systems, and heavy armor. And then there was oil, quietly reinforcing everything in the background. Saudi Arabia remained the world's swing producer, able to raise or cut output to stabilize global prices. That gave Washington confidence that even if Iran disrupted the supply, the market could be balanced. Another alignment took shape, more quietly, but just as important. Israel, though not formally allied with Saudi Arabia, found itself moving in the same direction. Both saw Iran as the central threat. Intelligence cooperation grew behind the scenes, especially around groups like Hezbollah and Iran's nuclear ambitions. What emerged was a counter-network with Saudi Arabia at the center, backed by American military power, financial leverage, and quiet Israeli support. And this is where we need to talk about the nuclear question, because it sits at the center of everything. Tehran has always maintained that its program was for peaceful use, electricity generation, medical isotopes. But outside of Iran, that argument never fully convinced anyone. From the early 2000s, concerns kept growing as evidence emerged of hidden facilities, expanded centrifuge programs, and uranium enrichment levels that went far beyond what a civilian program would require. After the Iraq War removed a major regional check on Iran, the program began to move faster. By the time inspectors uncovered sites like Natanz, Iran had already made significant progress. In 2015, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action brought temporary relief. Sanctions were eased, and Iran agreed to limit its enrichment. For a moment, it looked like the issue might stabilize. But in Riyadh, there was a deep skepticism from the start. Saudi leaders saw the deal as a pause, not a solution. When the agreement collapsed in 2018, those fears seemed to play out. Iran began accelerating once again, pushing enrichment levels towards 60% purity, not quite weapons grade, but technically very close. By the early 2020s, what experts called breakout time, the window needed to produce enough material for a weapon, had shrunk dramatically, in some estimates down to weeks. For Saudi Arabia, this was not just another security concern. A nuclear-capable Iran would not just strengthen Tehran directly, it could shield its network of regional allies, allowing them to operate with greater confidence while Saudi Arabia faced the risk of direct escalation. That kind of imbalance was unacceptable. That is why Mohammed bin Salman spoke so clearly. If Iran developed a nuclear weapon, Saudi Arabia would pursue one as well, and quickly. Then 2025 happened. Israel, with Washington's backing, moved beyond covert cyber campaigns and stepped into direct military action. Natanz, long the centerpiece of Iran's enrichment program, was struck with precise munitions aimed at disabling advanced centrifuge halls. Fordow, buried under a mountain and designed to withstand airstrikes, was attacked with bunker buster ordnance. Facilities near Isfahan, including uranium conversion sites and research centers, were also hit. Analysts estimated that the attacks destroyed or disabled hundreds of centrifuges and set back enrichment capacity by at least 2 to 3 years. Yet, the strikes did not eliminate the program. Iran dispersed much of its infrastructure, hardened key facilities, and stockpiled enriched uranium in multiple locations. Within months, inspectors reported that Iran was still holding over 120 kilograms of uranium, enriched to 60%, enough to shorten breakout time to mere weeks. Iran responded defiantly, accelerating work at undisclosed sites and restricting international inspectors further. For Saudi Arabia, the strikes were both a relief and a warning. Relief because Israel had acted on what Riyadh saw as an existential threat. Warning because even after such a heavy blow, Iran's nuclear capability remained alive. The nightmare of a nuclear-capable Iran had not been erased, only delayed. Now, let us talk about Yemen, because it is impossible to understand this rivalry without understanding what happens on Saudi Arabia's southern border. Look at the map and you can see why Iran made Yemen a battlefield. Yemen sits right along the Saudi border and straddles the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, a choke point through which nearly 10% of global trade and oil shipments pass. Influence there meant pressure right on the kingdom's doorstep and leverage over one of the world's most critical shipping routes. This is where the Houthis rose as a powerful force. Backed by Iran, they expanded their reach from Sada into the capital Sana'a by 2014. Iran did not deploy large armies. It relied on a low-cost, high-impact toolkit: ballistic missiles, drones capable of striking hundreds of kilometers inside Saudi territory, training, and sustained financial support. Saudi Arabia responded in 2015 with a military intervention called Operation Decisive Storm, mobilizing over 100 fighter jets, 150,000 troops, and coalition partners from 9 countries. And then the conflict delivered a shock that spread far beyond the region. In September of 2019, coordinated drone and cruise missile attacks hit the massive Abqaiq oil processing facility and the Khurais oil field. Abqaiq alone handles about 7 million barrels of oil per day, nearly half of Saudi Arabia's entire production capacity. Almost overnight, Saudi output dropped by 5.7 million barrels per day, roughly 5% of global supply. Oil prices spiked by 20% in a single day, the largest jump in decades. Tanker insurance costs soared, and the world was reminded how fragile the energy supply could be when a single strike in the desert reverberates across global markets. But behind the strategy was a devastating human cost. The war in Yemen triggered what the United Nations called the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Famine took hold across large areas. Medical systems collapsed. By 2022, estimates placed the total death toll from fighting, hunger, and disease at over 377,000 people, with 70% of those deaths being children under the age of 5. More than 4 million people were displaced. Over 24 million Yemenis, nearly 80% of the population, required humanitarian assistance. For millions, this was not about geopolitics. It was about daily survival. At the same time, another front burned just as intensely. In Syria, when the government faced collapse, Iran stepped in heavily to support Bashar al-Assad. It deployed thousands of Revolutionary Guard advisors and special units, funneled billions in financial aid, and worked closely with Hezbollah fighters on the ground. By 2013, Hezbollah had committed over 7,000 combatants to Syria, playing a decisive role in key battles. Saudi Arabia backed opposing forces, channeling money and weapons into rebel groups through covert networks. For Iran, however, Syria was not just one battlefield. It was a critical link, a corridor that connected Tehran to Baghdad, Damascus, and ultimately Hezbollah in Lebanon. The Syrian war became one of the deadliest conflicts of the 21st century. Over 500,000 people were killed, according to United Nations estimates. More than 6.8 million fled the country as refugees, with another 6 million displaced internally. Entire cities, Aleppo, Homs, Raqqa, were reduced to rubble. The economy collapsed, with gross domestic product shrinking by more than 60% between 2011 and 2016. Strip away the layers, and it was the same rivalry playing out in blood and ruin. Then there were the quieter arenas, places where influence grew without full-scale war. In Iraq, Iranian-backed militias gained real power inside both security forces and politics. In Lebanon, Hezbollah became the dominant force, shaping government decisions while maintaining a large arsenal. In Bahrain, Saudi Arabia sent troops in 2011 to shut down unrest it saw as linked to Iranian influence. One of the clearest flashpoints came in January of 2016 when Saudi Arabia executed Nimr al-Nimr, a prominent Shia cleric from the eastern province. He was not just a religious figure. He had become a strong and outspoken critic of the Saudi monarchy, calling for greater rights for the Shia minority. The reaction inside Iran was immediate and intense. Crowds filled the streets. Demonstrators stormed and set fire to the Saudi embassy in Tehran, forcing diplomats to flee. Within days, Saudi Arabia cut diplomatic ties with Iran, and several of its allies followed, deepening the divide even further. Sectarian lines hardened. Any remaining channels of dialogue between the two governments collapsed. What might have stayed a domestic issue instead became another flashpoint in a much larger Cold War. After years of this draining cycle, something unexpected began to take shape. In March of 2023, Saudi Arabia and Iran announced they would restore diplomatic ties, and the deal was not brokered by the United States, but by China. Beijing stepped in as the middleman, offering neutral ground and backing it with economic incentives. Within months, embassies reopened in both capitals, and the tone between the two sides softened. Saudi Arabia had strong reasons to calm things down. Its Vision 2030 plan depended on stability, foreign investment, and a predictable environment to diversify the economy. Iran, on the other side, was under heavy sanctions and constant pressure. Any breathing space was valuable. But once you look past the headlines, the limits of the agreement became clear. The hardest issues were left untouched. The war in Yemen was still unresolved. Iranian-backed militias across the region continued operating as before. The central question of who would dominate the Middle East was never even addressed. The handshake was real. The solution was not. The deal bought time, nothing more. And now we arrive at the present moment. On the 28th of February 2026, everything changed. The United States and Israel launched a coordinated series of airstrikes on Iran. The strikes killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, alongside dozens of senior military and government officials. It was the most dramatic single event in the Middle East since the fall of Saddam Hussein, and the consequences began immediately. According to major press reporting, Crown Prince Mohammad bin Salman had made multiple phone calls to the American president in the lead-up to the decision, urging the United States not to settle for half measures. Saudi Arabia and Israel had reportedly lobbied repeatedly for the strike, and then it happened. Iran's response was staggering in its scale and reach. For the first time in history, as documented by conflict monitoring groups, Iran struck every single Gulf Cooperation Council country simultaneously. Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates. Hundreds of ballistic missiles and thousands of drones were launched in a single sustained campaign. According to news agencies, Saudi Arabia has told Iran to stop the attacks, warning that continued strikes on the kingdom and its energy sector could push Riyadh to respond in kind. The Saudi foreign minister reportedly spoke directly to his Iranian counterpart, making the kingdom's position clear. Saudi Arabia was open to mediation, but the attacks had to stop. Iran's position, according to two sources cited by wire services, was that the strikes were not aimed at Gulf countries themselves, but at United States interests and military bases hosted on their territory. The strikes that hit Ras Tanura, Saudi Arabia's massive oil refinery complex, caused a limited fire from falling shrapnel, according to Saudi authorities. Greek-operated Patriot systems intercepted 2 Iranian ballistic missiles targeting Saudi oil refineries. The Saudi Ministry of Defense reported intercepting dozens of drones over Riyadh and the eastern province across multiple days of attacks. As reported by outlets tracking the crisis, a major airbase saw significant damage to United States aircraft stationed there. According to United States officials, 5 Air Force refueling planes were struck and damaged. A United States soldier later died from injuries sustained in the attacks. 29 additional United States servicemen were wounded in the first week of fighting alone. The new Supreme Leader is Mohammad Khamenei, son of the assassinated Ali Khamenei, elected on the 8th of March 2026 by the Assembly of Experts. Senior figures, including the Speaker of Parliament and the sitting president, pledged their allegiance. But the new leadership faces an Iran under sustained bombardment, with hundreds of strikes recorded across at least 26 of the country's 31 provinces. The economy, already strangled by snapback sanctions reinstated by the United Nations Security Council in September 2025, faces a new kind of destruction. At the same time, the broader alliance architecture around this rivalry is shifting in dramatic ways. Saudi Arabia and Pakistan signed a strategic mutual defense agreement in September 2025. The agreement, signed by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and the Pakistani Prime Minister, alongside the Pakistani Army Chief, included a mutual defense clause modeled on the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's collective defense principle. Any aggression against either country would be considered aggression against both. Pakistan, which shares a 900-kilometer border with Iran, suddenly found itself in an extraordinarily difficult position once the February strikes began. China, which had been the broker of the 2023 diplomatic normalization, found itself with influence but limited control. As analysts had noted, Beijing could open diplomatic doors, but it did not have the military reach to enforce stability when tensions rose. The international response reflected deep divisions. On the 26th of March, Saudi Arabia, along with the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and Jordan, jointly condemned Iran and its affiliated armed groups in Iraq for attacks against countries in the region and their infrastructure. The Saudi cabinet stated that it would take all necessary measures to defend the kingdom. At the same time, the Gulf states had consistently emphasized that they had not allowed their airspace or territory to be used for the United States and Israeli strikes on Iran. Saudi Arabia's refusal to provide access for the initial February strikes was described by regional policy institutes as a vindication of the détente policy. Riyadh had publicly condemned Israeli military actions against Iran, a remarkable statement given the decades of animosity. And yet, Iranian missiles were hitting Saudi refineries anyway. That contradiction tells you everything about where we are. Saudi Arabia finds itself in an almost impossible position. It lobbied for a strike that would weaken Iran. It then became a target of Iran's retaliation despite refusing direct participation. Its energy infrastructure is under attack. Its Vision 2030 economic transformation plans, built on stability and foreign investment, are under serious strain. And the question of whether containment or destruction is the right strategy remains unanswered. Iran, for its part, continues to play a different kind of game. Even under the most intense military pressure in its history, it is spreading the cost of war as widely as possible, hitting every Gulf state simultaneously, targeting energy infrastructure, threatening the Strait of Hormuz, and keeping pressure on multiple fronts at once. There are several paths ahead. None of them look entirely stable.